somewhere in the deep, highly trafficked waters of the Mediterranean or the vast expanses of the South China Sea, massive commercial vessels are vanishing from the global grid. They are aging behemoths, stripped of their digital tracking signatures, carrying millions of barrels of crude under the cover of darkness. This is not piracy or a localized smuggling ring. It is a state-sponsored logistical masterclass designed to rewrite the rules of global trade. The global energy market is undergoing a profound and silent transformation, driven by an armada of uninsured, unverified vessels operating entirely outside the reach of Western maritime regulations. This parallel infrastructure is systematically defying the economic weapons deployed by the world's most powerful nations. The stakes extend far beyond fluctuating commodity prices, striking at the very heart of international law, market transparency, and environmental safety. To understand the sheer scale of this operation requires investigating the mechanics of a hidden multi-billion-dollar economy. How does a major geopolitical power completely decouple its primary export from the established financial order? The answer lies in the creation of a vast, decentralized maritime network that systematically bypasses traditional choke points. This network is the shadow fleet, and it is the absolute reason a heavily sanctioned economy remains solvent today. The catalyst for this unprecedented shift was a sequence of strict economic measures implemented in rapid response to international conflict. Western nations, seeking to cripple a war machine without plunging the global economy into a catastrophic energy crisis, engineered a novel punitive mechanism. The core of this strategy was the implementation of severe Russian oil sanctions designed to restrict state revenue while simultaneously maintaining a steady global supply. The centerpiece of these sanctions was the G7 price cap. This policy was an intricate geopolitical maneuver, dictating that Russian crude could only be traded using Western maritime services if it was sold below a strictly enforced threshold. The logic was mathematically elegant. Buyers could still access the energy they desperately needed, but the profit margins feeding the sanctioned state would be severely compressed. The architects of the price cap relied on a fundamental assumption that established maritime logistics were indispensable. For decades, the global movement of crude depended on brokers and underwriters predominantly located in London and New York. Western institutions controlled over 90% of protection and indemnity insurance, coverage strictly essential for entering major ports and managing massive liabilities like environmental damage. By making this insurance contingent on the price cap, policymakers believed they possessed an infallible kill switch. If a seller breached the mandated price, coverage would be revoked, rendering the vessel unable to legally navigate international waters. But this reliance on institutional control underestimated the adaptability of a commodity-driven superpower. Faced with weaponized financial services, the sanctioned state initiated a rapid logistical pivot, secretly assembling a shadow fleet. Within months, hundreds of aging tankers destined for the scrapyard were purchased from the commercial market. They vanished into a labyrinth of obscure shell companies across the Middle East, Asia, and the Caribbean, bypassing traditional registries for flags of convenience. This ghost armada operates entirely outside the established global order, moving crude without Western certification, safety inspections, or standard maritime insurance. Because these tankers cannot rely on standard port services, they execute complex ship-to-ship transfers far offshore in international waters. Out in the open ocean, massive vessels rendezvous, connecting heavy hoses to pump millions of gallons of crude directly between holding tanks. During these transfers, ships deliberately disable their automatic identification systems. By going dark, they vanish from global tracking monitors. When a vessel emerges days later, its cargo has been transferred and blended, making the original source virtually impossible to prove. Through these opaque maneuvers, the shadow fleet systematically obscures the origin of the crude, allowing it to enter the global market under false pretenses. The oil is often relabeled as originating from intermediary nations, completely washing its sanctioned status. This logistical shell game ensures that the commodity reaches energy-hungry markets in Asia and beyond, generating billions in revenue that the sanctions were explicitly designed to block. The sheer volume of crude moving through this clandestine network is staggering. It is not a marginal leak in the sanctions regime. It is a structural bypass. By continuously defying the restrictions, the shadow fleet has demonstrated the limitations of financial warfare when applied to a foundational global commodity. The physical movement of energy has simply routed around the institutional roadblocks. Investigating the financial mechanics of this parallel market reveals a total ecosystem of evasion. To replace Western maritime insurance, alternative coverage is being provided by state-backed entities or obscure financial firms with questionable capitalization. Transactions are increasingly settled in alternative currencies, bypassing the traditional dollar clearing system and further insulating the trade from Western financial surveillance and enforcement mechanisms. This dynamic illustrates exactly how the shadow fleet keeps the sanctioned economy buoyant. By absorbing the additional logistical costs associated with longer shipping routes and clandestine transfers, the sellers can offer their crude at a discount to willing buyers. The resulting revenue stream, while perhaps slightly diminished by the inefficiencies of the shadow network, remains more than sufficient to sustain the state's strategic objectives. Beyond the immediate geopolitical and economic consequences, this parallel infrastructure presents a looming, catastrophic threat to the global environment. The vessels comprising the shadow fleet are disproportionately old, often operating well beyond the standard 20-year lifespan typical of commercial oil tankers. They are pushed to their structural limits, undertaking longer, more treacherous voyages without access to premier maintenance facilities. The risk of mechanical failure, structural collapse, or navigational error increases exponentially with every voyage. When these aging tankers operate in heavily trafficked straits or environmentally sensitive coastal waters, they carry the potential for unprecedented ecological disaster. The maritime community is increasingly alarmed by the frequency of near misses, engine failures, and groundings involving vessels that lack transparent ownership and recognized safety certifications. The critical, unanswered question is what exactly happens when one of these substandard tankers inevitably fails and manages to cause a major spill. In the legitimate shipping industry, established protection and indemnity clubs immediately mobilize billions of dollars in capital to fund environmental cleanup, compensate affected coastal communities, and salvage the wrecked vessel. The shadow fleet operates entirely without this vital safety net, leaving coastal nations highly and unfairly vulnerable. If a catastrophic spill were to occur, the obscure shell companies holding the title to the vessel would likely vanish overnight. The alternative insurance providers, lacking the capital reserves of their Western counterparts, would almost certainly default or refuse to pay out the astronomical costs of environmental remediation. The financial burden of cleaning up millions of gallons of toxic crude would fall entirely on the taxpayers of the affected coastal state. This environmental sword of Damocles hangs over some of the most vital maritime choke points in the world. The shadow fleet regularly traverses the Danish Straits, the English Channel, and the Strait of Malacca, bringing the risk of ecological ruin directly to the shores of nations that have strictly enforced the sanctions. The evasion of economic penalties has thus externalized a massive physical risk onto the global commons. The emergence of this parallel maritime infrastructure forces a profound reassessment of global economic statecraft. The assumption that control over financial and insurance services guarantees control over physical commodities has been fundamentally shattered. The creation of the Shadow Fleet proves that with sufficient capital and geopolitical will, a major power can construct an entirely independent logistical ecosystem, rendering traditional economic weapons largely obsolete. The vessels slipping off the radar in the dead of night are not merely evading a temporary policy measure. They are laying the groundwork for a permanently bifurcated global energy market. The system that keeps Russian oil flowing has rewritten the rules of international trade, proving that the flow of energy will always find a path of least resistance, regardless of the barriers placed in its way.